One bright, sunny day, a woman and her husband spent the day on the lake. He was an avid fisherman, and she loved enjoying the outdoors, so she figured they were in store for a very nice day together. As the hours went by, they were again out on a boat fishing. Her husband was having a great day. He was catching fish after fish after fish. She, on the other hand, hadn't caught anything. Her lack of success started to eat at her more and more with every passing hour. With every fish he caught, it just, drove home the point to her that she had none. When he caught his 8th fish, his 9th fish, his 10th fish. Well, the evening was fast approaching, and she still had not caught a fish. After one of her husband's catches, she asked him, "How many is that for you?" And he says, "Honestly, I haven't been keeping count." Well, she had, though. She knew this was numbered 19 for him on the day. But she didn't tell him that she knew how many it was. He was at 19 and she was at 0. All of a sudden, she felt a tug on her line. It was a fish, all right, and a big one, too. Her husband was genuinely excited for her, and he helped her out, saying, "Steady, steady," as she reeled it in. And wouldn't you know, the only fish that she caught that whole day was the biggest one of the day as well. It was a learning experience for her that day. She learned that God's timing is the most important thing. There are many times in her life when she didn't rely on God's timing, and she realized that she was miserable as a result of that. And who knows, on that day out on the lake, if she had caught several small fish earlier in the day, maybe she would have packed up an hour or two ago and left. But the fact that she hadn't caught anything made her more and more determined to catch a fish, and she was rewarded for her patience and her perseverance by catching the largest fish of the day. This morning, that's what we're going to look at, God's timing and why it is so important. And we're going to look at another passage in the New Testament where Jesus says his time has not come yet. And we find it in John chapter 7. Interestingly, in this passage, Jesus takes the opportunity to school his own brothers and sisters about who he is and what his purpose is as well. So we'll read the first 9 verses of John 7. Words in the NIV are on the screen. And the word of the Lord says, "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, 'Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world.' For even his own brothers did not believe in him. Therefore Jesus told them, 'My time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I am not going up to this festival, because my time has not yet fully come.' After he said this, he stayed in Galilee." The Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of his holy word. In this passage, of course, we see that Jesus' own brothers didn't accept him as the Son of God before his crucifixion and resurrection. And because they didn't, in this passage, we get insight into the mind of the unconverted, unregenerate soul. Isn't it ironic that Jesus' own siblings at this time were not saved? In John 7, we see their taunting words as they say, "Jesus, since you say you're the Son of God, why not reveal yourself? "What are you waiting for, Jesus?" And they're saying this in disbelief because they don't believe that Jesus is who he says he is. So they go and tempt him to go and prove it. Big mistake, because their words reveal a lot about their character, or lack of character, I should say, and lack of a relationship with God. But that's not all. Not only do they not have a clue about God's timing, but we also see they don't have a clue about who Jesus is, because they say no one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. When I read these words, I think, wow, that really takes nerve, doesn't it? They're pretty much insinuating that Jesus is using this story of him being the Messiah, the Savior of the world, to feed his own ego and become popular. Well, it disregards everything that Jesus has said up to this point, because we can't read Jesus' words without realizing that he always submitted himself completely to the will of God. It wasn't at all about Jesus wanting to be a public figure. His brothers were implying that Jesus was some kind of opportunist in this whole scheme. And I'm sure they were jealous of him as well. They came from a poor family, so I'm sure that if they could have fame, they would jump at the opportunity. But if they would have that opportunity, it would only serve to puff up their own egos. Not so with Jesus. Interestingly, in this brief conversation, the siblings stumbled across something that they were actually correct about, despite their ignorance. And I guess, as if you've ever heard the expression, a blind squirrel gets a nut every now and then, these blind squirrels got a nut. What they were right about is Jesus having to go to Jerusalem. It is true that he would have to go there to be crucified, but they were ignoring the events and the timing of these events that would have to take place, which is of the greatest importance. There were still more things for Jesus to do. He had to teach more. He had to do God's will, which was that he not be crucified yet. Now think of it this way. If Jesus had taken their advice and gone up to Jerusalem at that time, he wouldn't have been around for several very important things. He wouldn't have been around to heal the man who was born blind, and you can be sure that meant an awful lot to that man. He also wouldn't have been around 4 days after Lazarus died and resurrected him back to life, which displays for everyone Jesus' power over death. And I'm sure Lazarus appreciated that too. Jesus wouldn't have been around for the Last Supper, where he washed his disciples' feet, demonstrating true servanthood. And here in John 7, Jesus wasn't in the proper position to be betrayed by his own disciple Judas. Not only was that betrayal important because it was an event of prophecy, but it also serves as an example to future believers of the possible risk of being a believer and follower of Jesus Christ. These were just a few things that Jesus would have missed out on if he didn't follow God's plan. Just like Jesus, we have to be more concerned about doing things in God's will and on God's time schedule than doing our own will and on our own time schedule. We've established now that God's timing is very important, but oftentimes from our narrow perspective, we just don't see the whole picture. People don't realize that the times whenever we do things outside of God's timing, it can have disastrous consequences. I hope maybe an illustration from nature can make this a little more clear. Maybe you've seen these Ocean Spray commercials on television for the juice, And the one commercial in particular has a couple guys standing in overalls in knee-high water talking about their juice and how they make it and all that stuff. And on top of the water, you see thousands of cranberries just floating on this farm. When I first saw the commercial, I wondered, why in the world are these men wading in a sea of cranberries? Doesn't really make sense. Well, it turns out that that is one of the ways that you can easily harvest cranberries. You see, each berry has a pocket of air inside it, so that it essentially floats on water. So what they do is they flood the field with about 18 inches of water the night before, so that the cranberries rise to the top, and then the next day they churn the water so that the force of the water against the berries loosens them. Then they just scoop up the berries and drain the field. Well, timing is very important when you're harvesting cranberries. You have to harvest at a very specific time. It has to be in the fall, but not just any time in the fall. The berries, of course, must be ripe, but not frozen. And you certainly can't flood a field with water when you expect the temperature to dip down below freezing that night. Otherwise, you're going to have quite a mess on your hands. So it leaves a narrow window of opportunity to harvest your crop. In that same way, in John 7, the timing had to be right for Jesus, and it just wasn't the right timing for him to go to Jerusalem. Verse 1 of the chapter informs us that by this time the Jews were looking for a way to kill Jesus. Therefore, what he could best do is avoid them at all costs and stay alive. Later in John, 5 chapters later, however, things change for Jesus. At that time, you'll read that he says, "The hour has now come for the Son of Man to be glorified." In John 12, Jesus again shows that he has clearly accepted God's timeline for his life, and at that time had now come. This is not the case for the unregenerate and unsaved person, such as Jesus' brothers. For them, any time will do. That's because they aren't concerned about anything but themselves. Jesus even says this in verse 6, "My time is not here yet, for you, any time will do." What Jesus is saying is that the unsaved person is, at heart, a self-centered person. You can do what you want, when you want, all because you're really all that you care about. This unsaved person is primarily concerned with doing their own will and not the will of God. What makes me happy? What satisfies my desires? What makes me feel good? Now, before you think that I'm too harsh on unsaved people, believe me, I was one at one time, I anticipate a rebuttal here. Does it mean that an unsaved person can't do anything good or nice? Of course not. I admit that unsaved people do nice things all the time. For instance, take these celebrities who raise a lot of money for good causes. The problem is that none of the praise for doing these good things goes to God, does it? Even if they aren't being charitable for the purpose of giving glory to God, you know someone is getting glory for this. Someone's getting adoration for this. And if you are giving to someone else what rightfully belongs to God, you are guilty of idolatry. You have, in essence, created a God in your own mind because you refuse to give God the glory that is rightfully His. This is more prevalent in everyday life than we realize. And take pregnancy, for instance. I know I'm really switching gears now, but stay with me on this. When a woman is pregnant, it is a very emotional time. And you hear these untold number of stories from women who have tried to have a baby but weren't able to. For some of them, it has been God's way of teaching them to rely on Him as they learn the value of patience, while for others, maybe it's a way for God to direct their attention to other options, such as adoption, for instance, because there's millions of babies out there who don't belong to a loving family. Or maybe not having a baby at all is the best way that God can free up their time to do even more of His work. Timing is especially important because when two people start a family together, it is common for young couples to be pressured into making serious decisions by their family and friends. And maybe some of these decisions they aren't ready to do so yet. Maybe they're right out of school and they haven't had an established career, an income stream, and those kind of things. Maybe they're simply not mature enough to start a family. So inevitably the question is going to come, when are you getting married? So maybe they give in to the pressure and get married. But that's not enough now, is it? You know what the next question is? You're shaking your head. When are you having a baby? Okay? So maybe they're not financially able to do it, but pressure, they give in, they have a baby. Maybe that'll quiet them down now. No. Apparently, there's some other rule that says children are like Lay's potato chips. You can't have just one. Okay? So you find yourself being pressured to have another baby. So before you know it, you find yourself married with 2 kids and you wonder how this all happened. Not only that, I pity the couple who has 2 boys or 2 girls. Maybe you know what's coming now. Because apparently there's some other rule that says you have to have at least 1 boy and at least 1 girl. So the question is, when are, like our situation, we had 2 girls that we love very much. When are you having a boy? Oh, well, maybe I'm overthinking this a little bit, but for me, it just sends a subtle message to your last child that they weren't quite what you wanted now, does it? Okay? Honestly, I don't really have much tolerance for this kind of stuff anymore. Whenever I was younger, I would just go along with it and just keep my mouth shut. But whenever people say such nonsensical questions such as, when are you having a boy or when are you having a girl, it makes me want to say, oh, I'm sorry, when we left the hospital the second time, I wasn't thinking. I picked out the wrong one. Let me take her back and get what you think I should have, okay? You know, it's just, you know, people don't think whenever they talk, but that's a whole other message. The point is that in all of our life decisions, and especially the major ones too, they should all be made with concern for God's timing. Let's go back to the first domino that falls in that process of starting a family, which is getting married. Did you know that according to recent studies, if you line up every married American, 1 out of every 4, 25%, admit they wish they weren't married to their spouse? 25% say they wish they had a do-over. I think a lot of that results from people getting married with no regard to the will of God in their life, and now they are paying the price for their disobedience. In marriage, as in so many other areas of life, oftentimes we don't want to wait for God to make that way apparent to us. We force the issue, and then years down the road, we wonder why things hadn't turned out as we planned. I think it's clear by now that God's all about timing, isn't He? In Romans, the Apostle Paul writes, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Even Paul picks up on this importance of time when he says at just the right time, which is what Jesus was patiently waiting for in John 7. Any old time isn't going to do for God, but it's good for the unsaved people, like Jesus' brothers. So the issue becomes, do you choose to do things in accordance to God's time, or do you just choose any time? One focuses on God while the other focuses on you or us. Living the Christian life is not easy because Satan and his forces are constantly trying to trip us up, and the last thing that you need is to be struggling against God also. It's like fighting with a member of your own team. It makes no sense. Nothing good can come of this. So the good way is to walk in harmony with God and to accept His will for our lives. And this includes His timing as well. Being a believer in Christ is never about us. It's always about Him. So why would we want to force His will into our timeline? God's will was determined long before we ever conceived of our schedule in the first place. And I, for one, am thankful that God doesn't do things in accordance to our timeline, considering how often we change the things that we want. Today we want this, tomorrow we want that, and next week will be another thing. I want to close by going back to the woman in the opening fishing illustration. I think we've all, to some extent or another, been in her shoes before. She realized after the fact that she would have been more content during the fishing trip if she hadn't been worrying about how well her husband was doing, constantly comparing herself to him. Let's stop comparing ourselves to others and feeling sorry for ourselves because the good things have happened to others already but haven't happened to us yet. The fact is that if anything is in God's will, it will come to pass. God doesn't need us to step over and take control of the reins for Him. It is His will after all. For each of us here, no matter what we are dealing with, we need to determine if we are going to step aside and accept God's time, or are we going to force the issue and settle for any old time, which will do nothing but make